The fourth morning, the foal no longer reached for the bottle. Frost clung to the barn rails, and the wind moved through the prairie as if nothing had changed. Then, from beyond the paddock, an old racehorse stepped forward, slow, deliberate, crossing a line no one expected him to cross. The cold did not arrive all at once. It settled in layers, first along the fence posts, then across the packed earth, and finally inside the small wooden barn where a newborn foal stood alone. Eli had been brought in just before dawn, still damp from the night, his thin coat unable to hold back the last breath of winter lingering over the Montana plains. No one had seen the mare fall. The storm had come quickly, a sharp wind that erased tracks and muffled sound. By the time the search team found the foal, he was standing near the edge of a dry creek bed, his legs trembling beneath him, his eyes fixed on something no longer there. Inside the barn, the air was warmer, but not by much. A single heat lamp cast a steady glow over the straw. It wasn't enough to mimic the weight of a body beside him, or the quiet rhythm he had known only hours before. Eli did not lie down. He did not call out. He simply stood, his head lowered, as if waiting for the world to return to its previous shape. "Easy now," Martha said softly, kneeling just outside the stall. Her voice carried the kind of calm that came from years of doing this. Rescuing, stabilizing, waiting. She held a bottle close to her chest for a moment before easing it forward, careful not to startle him. The milk was warm, measured precisely, the way it had worked before. Eli didn't move. His ears flicked once, not toward her, but toward the open side of the barn, where the wind pressed lightly against the wood. The bottle hovered near his mouth, untouched. Martha stayed there longer than she needed to, long enough for the quiet to grow heavy. Then she lowered the bottle and stood, her knees stiff from the cold floor. "He's not taking it?" Daniel asked from the doorway. She shook her head. "Not yet." They didn't speak much after that. There was a rhythm to these situations. Try, wait, adjust, repeat. Panic didn't help, not with foals, not with anything that fragile. Through the rest of the morning they returned, again and again. The same careful approach, the same measured patience. The bottle never left Eli's line of sight, but neither did it reach him. By midday, the sun had broken through the cloud line, casting long, pale light across the paddock. Frost began to melt in thin, uneven patches. The ranch looked almost peaceful from a distance, as if nothing inside it had shifted. At the far end of the enclosure, separated by a stretch of worn fence and quiet ground, another horse stood facing the barn. Caleb did not move much anymore. Age had settled into his joints the way cold settled into the wood, gradually, then all at once. His coat, once sleek and burnished under track lights, now held a duller tone, like something softened by time rather than worn out. He had been here for nearly 2 years, long enough for the routines to become predictable. Feed, walk, rest. Nothing in those routines required urgency. But that morning, something had pulled his attention toward the barn. It wasn't the voices. They were steady, familiar. It wasn't the scent of grain or hay. Those drifted across the property every day. It was something quieter, a stillness that didn't belong. Caleb shifted his weight slightly, his ears angling forward. From where he stood, the barn door framed a narrow slice of shadow. Within it, the small figure of the foal was barely visible, a shape that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. He watched longer than he usually would. Back inside, Eli's legs wavered, not enough to fall, but enough to draw Martha's eye. "Come on," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She reached for the bottle again, slower this time, as if reducing movement might make a difference. The tip brushed lightly against his muzzle. Nothing. No resistance. No acceptance. just absence. She exhaled quietly, her breath visible in the cool air. Outside, Caleb took a single step forward. It was not much, barely enough to leave an impression in the softening ground. But it was the first time that day he had moved toward something instead of away from it. Inside the barn, Eli shifted his head a fraction, not toward the bottle, not toward Martha, but toward the open doorway, where the light stretched just a little farther than before. And for a brief moment, something changed in the way he held himself, not stronger, not steadier, but less distant. Martha noticed it. She didn't say anything, but she stayed where she was, watching, waiting for it to happen again. It didn't. The moment passed as quietly as it had come. By late afternoon, the shadows grew longer, and the temperature began to drop again. The routines continued, the attempts, the pauses, the careful adjustments. But something else had entered the space between those actions, something not yet understood, not yet named. And outside the barn, the old racehorse did not return to his usual place by the far fence. He remained there, just within view of the doorway, as if the distance itself had begun to matter. By the second day, the routine had become quieter. Not because there was less to do, but because everyone had begun to move with a kind of measured restraint, like stepping across thin ice. Every sound inside the barn seemed to carry farther than it should. Boots against wood, the soft click of a bottle cap. Even breath felt louder in the cold. Eli was still standing. That, at least, was something. But the way he stood had changed. His legs no longer trembled in sharp bursts. Instead, they held a slow, wavering tension, as if he were conserving what little strength remained. His head hung lower now, angled just enough to keep the world in view without engaging with it. Martha approached again, her movements smaller than the day before. She didn't speak this time. She had learned that words didn't reach him. The bottle came first, warm, steady, familiar. She held it near his mouth, waiting for even the slightest sign. Nothing. She didn't push it forward. Not yet. Behind her, Daniel adjusted the heat lamp, angling it to keep the light consistent as the sun shifted outside. They had already tried bringing in another mare earlier that morning. A calm one. Gentle. The kind that usually settled foals within minutes. Eli hadn't reacted. He hadn't turned away either. He had simply remained where he was, untouched by the presence, as if whatever connection should have formed had already been severed beyond reach. "He's not rejecting it," Daniel said quietly. Martha nodded. "No. He's just not there." That was the part that unsettled her. Rejection could be worked with. Resistance meant something was still active, still fighting. But this absence, left nothing to respond to. They stepped back again, giving him space. Outside, the paddock stretched under a pale sky. The frost had fully lifted now, leaving the ground damp and dark. A few horses grazed near the far side, their movements slow and unhurried, following rhythms that hadn't changed. Caleb stood closer than he had the day before. Not near enough to draw attention from the others, but close enough that the barn door no longer framed him at a distance. He had shifted along the fence line gradually, in small increments that no one had marked as unusual. Until now. Daniel noticed him first. "That one's been there a while," he said, nodding towards the paddock. Martha followed his gaze. Caleb wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary. No pacing, no agitation. Just standing, head level, ears forward, watching the open doorway. "He usually stays by the east fence," Daniel added. Martha didn't respond immediately. She watched for a moment longer, then turned back to Eli. Inside the barn, the air felt heavier. Eli's breathing had slowed. Not dangerously, but noticeably. Each inhale came shallow, each exhale softer than the last. His body hadn't collapsed, but it no longer held itself with intention. It simply remained upright, as if gravity hadn't yet decided what to do with him. Martha crouched again, but this time without the bottle. She stayed just outside the stall, hands resting on her knees, not reaching, not guiding, just present. Minutes passed. The wind outside shifted direction, pushing a faint current of cold air through the doorway. It moved across the floor in a slow line, brushing against Eli's legs before fading into the corners of the barn. His ears twitched. Just once. It was subtle, easy to miss, but it was there. Martha's eyes lifted slightly, not toward him, but toward the doorway. Caleb had taken another step forward. The distance between him and the barn had shortened enough now that his shape filled more of the frame. His posture remained unchanged, calm, grounded, but something in the way he held his head had shifted. Not higher, not tense, focused. He wasn't looking at the people. He was looking at the foal. Daniel exhaled slowly beside her. "You think he hears him?" Martha didn't answer right away. Inside the stall, Eli adjusted his weight. Barely noticeable, just a slight shift from one foreleg to the other. But it was the first voluntary movement they had seen in hours, not toward the bottle, not toward the warmth, toward the open space, toward the doorway. Martha stood carefully, stepping back to widen the view between the stall and the outside. She didn't signal Daniel. She didn't call attention to it. She just allowed the line between them to remain open. Caleb didn't move again. He didn't need to. The stillness between the two animals carried something the barn hadn't held before. Not sound, not motion, but a kind of quiet alignment that didn't require intervention. Eli's head lifted a fraction higher. Not enough to change anything yet, but enough to suggest that something, however small, had begun to shift. The bottle remained untouched. The air remained cold. But the distance between the foal and the world around him no longer felt absolute. And for the first time since he had been brought in, Martha chose not to reach for him again. By the third morning, the barn no longer felt like a place of intervention. It had become a place of waiting. The routines were still there, measured, careful, practiced, but they had softened around the edges. No one moved with urgency anymore. Not because the situation had improved, but because something had shifted in the way they understood it. Eli was still not eating, but he was no longer entirely still. Martha noticed it first in the way he held his head. It didn't hang as low as before. Not by much, just enough to change the line of his neck, to let a thin strip of light catch along the curve of his jaw. His eyes, once dulled by distance, now followed movement in slow, deliberate arcs. Not everything, just certain things. She didn't reach for the bottle right away. Instead, she stayed near the edge of the stall, her body turned slightly away, giving him a wider field of view. The door remained open behind her, framing the pale stretch of paddock beyond. And there, just outside, Caleb stood. He had moved closer again during the night. No one had seen him do it. There were no disturbed fences, no broken latches, just a gradual shortening of space that now placed him within clear sight of the stall. He wasn't pressed against the boundary. He didn't call out or paw the ground. His presence was steady, unforced. A quiet shape against the soft gold of early morning. Eli shifted his weight. It was slow, almost hesitant, as if the movement itself required permission. His front leg slid forward a fraction, pressing lightly into the straw before settling again. The motion was small, but it held intention. Martha didn't speak. She had learned that stillness was the only language Eli seemed willing to meet. The wind moved gently through the open doorway, carrying with it the scent of dry grass and earth. It brushed along the edge of the stall, lifting a few strands of straw before settling again. Caleb didn't react to it. He remained as he was, head level, ears forward, eyes fixed not on the people, but on the foal. Daniel stepped quietly to Martha's side. "He's been there since before sunrise," he whispered, Martha gave a small nod. Her attention never left Eli. Inside the stall, the foal's ears flicked again, this time not in isolation but in sequence. A brief adjustment, then another, as if trying to locate something just beyond reach. His head lifted a little higher. Not fully, but enough. The line of sight between him and the paddock cleared, unobstructed now by the angle of his own body. For a moment, his gaze settled, direct, unblinking. On Caleb. There was no immediate response. No step forward, no sound, just a quiet recognition that lingered in the space between them. Martha exhaled slowly, barely audible. "Don't move," Daniel murmured. She hadn't planned to. Time stretched differently in that moment. The barn seemed to hold its breath, every creak of wood and shift of air fading into the background. Eli adjusted again, this time more clearly. His body angled slightly toward the doorway, his stance no longer fixed in place. It wasn't a step, not yet, but it was a change in direction. Caleb remained still. He did not close the distance, he did not signal, he simply stayed. And in that stillness, something passed between them. Not visible, not measurable, but undeniable in its effect. Eli's breathing deepened. Not by much, but enough to alter the rhythm. Each inhale carried a trace more weight, each exhale a fraction more release. The tightness that had held his body rigid for 2 days began to loosen, thread by thread. Martha lowered herself slowly to the ground just outside the stall, reducing her presence even further. Her hands rested loosely in her lap, her posture open, non-intrusive. She wasn't part of the exchange, not this time. Minutes passed. The sun rose higher, warming the edge of the doorway, casting a thin band of light across the straw. It reached Eli's front hooves first, then climbed slowly upward. He didn't move away from it. He let it reach him. Outside, a distant sound of hooves echoed faintly as the other horses shifted along the far fence. Caleb did not turn toward them. His focus never broke. Eli's head lifted another inch. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he leaned forward, not toward the bottle. Not toward the warmth, toward the open space, toward the presence that asked nothing of him. Martha felt it before she fully saw it. The subtle shift from isolation to awareness, from absence to the first fragile edge of connection. She didn't speak. She didn't move. Because whatever was happening between the two horses, it was unfolding in a space no human could enter without breaking it. And for the first time since Eli had arrived, the barn no longer felt like a place where something was being lost. It felt like a place where something might return. Outside, Caleb stood as he had all morning, quiet, patient, unchanged. But the distance between them had already begun to close. The wind picked up again toward midday, carrying a sharper edge than the morning had held. It pressed against the barn walls in slow, uneven breaths, slipping through the narrow gaps between boards, stirring the straw just enough to remind everyone how fragile the warmth inside really was. Martha had not moved far. She remained seated just beyond the stall, her presence steady but distant, as if she had learned exactly where the boundary lay, and how not to cross it. Eli stood where he had been for most of the morning, but something about him no longer felt fixed in place. His head was higher now, his gaze no longer drifting without direction. It settled, returned, adjusted, always finding its way back to the open doorway, back to the shape beyond it. Caleb. Outside, the paddock stretched under a pale sky, the ground still damp from thaw. The other horses had drifted toward the far fence, their attention turned elsewhere, their movements slow and familiar. Caleb remained apart. Closer than before. Close enough now that the line between barn and field felt thinner than it had any right to be. Daniel noticed it first. "He's inside the perimeter," he said quietly, his voice low enough not to disturb the stillness. Martha followed his gaze. The temporary gate that divided the paddock from the barn entrance had been loosened earlier that morning during feed rounds. It hadn't been left open, but it hadn't been secured the way it should have been either. Caleb stood just beyond it. Not pushing, not testing, just there. Martha didn't move to correct it. Not yet. Inside the stall, Eli shifted again, this time more clearly. His front leg stepped forward, pressing into the straw with a soft, deliberate weight. The movement was unsteady, but it held purpose. His body followed a fraction behind, adjusting to the new balance. It was the first step he had taken since arriving. Martha's breath caught, but she said nothing. Outside, Caleb lowered his head slightly. Not in a gesture of dominance, not even an invitation, just a quiet adjustment, aligning himself with the space in front of him. The wind passed between them again, carrying scent, warmth, something older than sound. Eli's ears turned forward, his head lifted, and for a brief moment the distance between them felt like something that could be crossed. Caleb moved, one step, measured, unhurried. The loose gate shifted slightly as his shoulder brushed against it, the wood giving just enough to open a narrow passage. Daniel inhaled sharply beside Martha. "Should I?" "No," she said, barely above a whisper. Caleb stepped through. There was no tension in him, no sign of agitation or uncertainty. His movement was deliberate, grounded in a calm that did not need to announce itself. He entered the space just outside the stall and stopped. Not close enough to crowd, not far enough to retreat, exactly where he needed to be. Eli did not pull back. He did not freeze. He watched. The air between them tightened, not with fear, but with attention. Caleb took another step, closer now. Close enough that the light from the doorway framed both of them in the same line. Martha remained still, her hands resting against her knees, her body angled away to give them the full space. No one spoke, no one interfered. Caleb lowered his head further. Slowly, carefully. The movement carried no force, no urgency, only intention. Eli's breath deepened, his chest rising more fully than it had since the night he arrived. For a second, nothing happened. Then, just barely, Eli leaned forward. The distance closed. Caleb's muzzle hovered near the foal's shoulder, pausing there, allowing the contact to be Eli's choice. And then it happened. A light touch, brief, soft, gone almost as quickly as it came. But it was enough. Eli did not withdraw. He did not shut down. He remained. The connection held, not as a moment, but as a presence. Caleb lifted his head slightly, not breaking the space, only easing the pressure of it. Eli adjusted again, his stance more stable now, his weight distributed with a new sense of balance. Behind them, the barn seemed to exhale. Martha's eyes softened, but she did not move. Because whatever had just happened did not belong to her. It belonged to the quiet exchange between two animals who had found something in each other that no one else had been able to provide. Caleb stayed. He did not step back. He did not leave. He simply remained within reach, steady, grounded, unchanged. And for the first time since the storm, Eli did not look like he was waiting for something to return. He looked like he was beginning to respond to what was already there. The bottle still rested against the wall, untouched. But now, for the first time, it felt like something that might be used again. Not because it was offered, but because Eli might choose it. The change did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, small, uneven, almost easy to dismiss if no one had been watching closely. Caleb remained by the stall through the afternoon. Not fixed in place, but present in a way that held the space steady. When Eli shifted, Caleb adjusted. When Eli stilled, Caleb did the same. There was no pattern to follow, no visible signal being exchanged, only a quiet rhythm that seemed to build between them. Martha waited longer than she had before. The bottle sat where she had left it, leaning against the wooden wall, its warmth fading slowly. She did not reach for it immediately. Not after what she had seen. Some things needed to unfold without interruption. Eli lowered his head once, briefly, as if the effort of standing had begun to return to him in a different way, not as strain, but as awareness. His legs, though still unsteady, no longer trembled with the same empty exhaustion. There was weight in them now. Not strength, not yet, but something closer to intention. Caleb shifted a step to the side, not away, just enough to change the angle between them. The doorway light moved across Eli's body, catching along his shoulder, outlining the slight rise and fall of his breathing. The air had warmed, just enough to soften the edges of the cold that had settled in since the storm. Martha reached for the bottle. Slowly, carefully. She approached without stepping into the narrow line between Eli and Caleb. Her movement was deliberate, angled, as if acknowledging that whatever held the foal's attention was not hers to interrupt. Eli saw her. This time his gaze did not pass through. It landed, held. The bottle lifted slightly, stopping just short of contact. No pressure, no insistence, just an offering. For a moment, nothing changed. The silence stretched again, but it was no longer empty. Eli's ears shifted forward. His head tilted a fraction, aligning with the shape of the bottle. The movement was slow, uncertain, as if guided by something unfamiliar. Caleb remained still, not withdrawing, not advancing. Just there. Eli leaned forward. The distance closed in small increments, each one tentative, each one holding the possibility of stopping. The tip of the bottle touched his muzzle. He paused. Martha did not move. She did not adjust her grip or encourage him forward. She simply held the position, steady, allowing the choice to remain his. Eli's breath brushed against the rubber. Then, almost imperceptibly, his lips shifted. A test, a recognition. The first pull was weak, barely enough to draw anything through. The bottle moved slightly in Martha's hands, but she steadied it, keeping the angle consistent. Eli pulled again, this time stronger. A small swallow followed, then another. The sound was quiet, nearly lost beneath the soft movement of wind outside. But it carried weight. Caleb lifted his head just enough to watch. Not closer, not farther, only observing. Eli continued. The rhythm was uneven, interrupted by pauses that stretched just long enough to question whether he would continue. But each time he returned. Not because he was urged, not because he was forced, because he chose to. Martha exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering as the tension she had carried since the storm began to ease. She did not speak. There was nothing to say that wouldn't break the moment. The barn, once filled with careful intervention, now held something quieter, something that did not require instruction. Eli drank until the bottle lightened in her hands, not empty, but no longer untouched. When he pulled back, it was not with the same absence as before. His head remained lifted, his body aligned differently, more balanced over his legs. Caleb stepped back then, only a single pace, enough to widen the space again, not leaving, not, just returning the distance to something that no longer needed to be closed. Martha lowered the bottle, her hands steady. "Good," she whispered, barely audible. Eli's ears flicked once, not away, but in acknowledgement of sound, of presence, of the world around him. Outside, the light had shifted toward evening. The paddock stretched wide under a soft, golden sky. The other horses moved slowly along the fence line, their shapes blending into the long shadows that reached across the ground. A few days later, Eli stepped beyond the stall for the first time. The air outside carried the scent of dry grass and earth, warmer now, more familiar. His legs wavered as they met the uneven ground, but he adjusted quickly, finding a rhythm that held. Caleb was there, not leading, not guiding, walking parallel just beyond reach, his pace steady, his presence unchanged. Eli followed, not closely, not with urgency, but with a quiet consistency that had not been there before. They moved across the paddock in silence, their steps out of sync but aligned in direction. The wind passed through them, lifting the edges of their coats, carrying the sound of distant movement across the land. From the barn, Martha watched. She did not call out. She did not step forward, because the work that had begun inside those wooden walls had moved beyond her hands. Eli paused once, turning his head slightly as if testing the space around him. Caleb slowed, waited, not asking, not expecting, just present. Eli stepped forward again, and this time the movement did not hesitate. It continued. Out into the open field, where the ground stretched wide and unbroken, where the horizon held steady, and where the space between one step and the next no longer felt uncertain. Behind them, the barn stood quiet. The bottle rested against the wall, no longer the center of the story. What remained was something simpler, a choice that had been made in stillness, a life that had turned, not through force, but through presence, and an old racehorse, once defined by speed, now standing as something else entirely, a steady point in the wide, shifting landscape of another's beginning. Sometimes, survival doesn't begin with strength, it begins with feeling seen. Eli lived because something stood beside him without asking, without forcing. In a world that moves fast, this story reminds us, presence can heal what effort cannot. If this touched you, there are more quiet, powerful journeys ahead waiting to be told.
If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts below and subscribe to Horse Heart Healing for more.